On the morning of February 5, 1944, Kapitänleutnant Sunao Tabata stood in the control room of Submarine I-175, 80 meters below the surface of the Pacific. His hydrophone operator had detected a destroyer escort's propellers. The sound was growing louder, closer. Then, the operator heard something he'd never encountered before. A series of rapid thumps, not the familiar splashes of depth charges being rolled off a ship's stern. These were different, sharper, closer together. 24 distinct sounds, then silence. Tabata ordered emergency deep. The crew scrambled to flood ballast tanks. I-175 began descending through 200 feet. Still nothing. 250 feet. The crew exchanged glances. Perhaps the Americans had missed. Perhaps their weapons had malfunctioned. Perhaps they would survive this encounter like they'd survived others. Then the first Hedgehog hit the pressure hull. The explosion was different from anything the crew had experienced, not the distant thunder of a depth charge detonating 50 meters away. This was immediate, direct, a 35-pound Torpex warhead exploding against the hull plates. The sound was catastrophic, metal tearing, rivets shearing, water roaring through a 7-inch hole at 400 gallons per minute. The submarine lurched, emergency lighting flickered, men screamed. A second Hedgehog struck near the conning tower, then a third. I-175 died in 90 seconds. 55 Japanese submariners died with her. The USS Charette had just recorded the first Hedgehog kill in the Pacific theater. The weapon had worked exactly as designed. But for Kriegsmarine U-boat crews in the Atlantic, the Hedgehog had already been killing submarines for over a year, and most German commanders still didn't understand what was destroying their boats. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of anti-submarine warfare in 1942 were brutal and straightforward. Out of every 100 depth charge attacks by British escort vessels, fewer than 2 resulted in confirmed kills. The ratio was 60-1, 60 attacks to sink a single U-boat. That meant 59 opportunities for the submarine to escape, 59 chances for an experienced commander to evade, to dive deeper, to change course during the blind period when sonar contact was lost. Depth charges had to be dropped directly over the target's estimated position. The escort ship would acquire sonar contact, calculate the submarine's course and speed, then run directly at the target at maximum speed. But as the ship closed to within 400 meters, a physical limitation rendered the submarine effectively invisible. The speed of sound in water is 1,500 meters per second. When a submarine was directly beneath an attacking ship, the time for the sonar ping to return merged with the initial pulse. The human operator couldn't distinguish between the outgoing signal and the returning echo. This instantaneous echo created a blind spot, a dead zone. The submarine disappeared from sonar exactly when the escort needed targeting information most. The ship would continue its attack run blind, estimating where the submarine would be by the time depth charges rolled off of the stern rails. German U-boat commanders were trained to exploit this vulnerability. The moment sonar contact was lost, they would order emergency turns. Hard, to port or starboard. Change depth. Reverse course. Anything to be somewhere other than where the escort expected them to be. The depth charges would detonate 30 seconds later at their preset depth. Maybe 200 feet, maybe 300. If the submarine was within 50 meters of a detonation, the hydrostatic shock might damage equipment, shatter light bulbs, crack gauge faces, spring leaks, but the submarine would survive. The crew would count the explosions. 8 depth charges. 10, 12. The attacks would continue for hours. Hundreds of depth charges. U-427 survived 678 depth charge attacks in April 1945. The crew endured hours of thunder, hours of terror, but they survived because not one depth charge scored a direct hit. The depth charge was fundamentally a weapon of attrition. Multiple near misses might accumulate enough damage to force a submarine to surface, but that required sustained attacks over many hours, consuming massive quantities of explosives, while the submarine executed evasion maneuvers. and after every depth charge pattern exploded, the underwater turbulence rendered sonar useless for 15 minutes. The escort couldn't maintain contact, couldn't tell if the submarine was damaged or escaping, couldn't resume the attack until the water settled. British naval engineers understood these limitations. They'd understood them since World War I. The question was how to solve them. The answer required a weapon that could attack while sonar contact was maintained. A weapon that could be fired forward over the ship's bow, landing in the water ahead of the vessel while the submarine was still detectable. A weapon that wouldn't explode unless it scored a direct hit, eliminating the sonar blackout that depth charges created. The solution emerged from an unlikely source. Between the wars, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker of the Royal Artillery had developed a type of infantry mortar called a spigot discharger. Instead of the conventional mortar design, where the projectile fit inside a barrel, Blacker's system used a fixed steel rod. The projectile had a hollow tail that fit over the rod. When fired, a propellant charge at the base of the rod launched the projectile into the air. The design was brilliantly simple. One launcher could fire projectiles of different sizes and weights. The propellant charge remained constant. Only the projectile changed. The British Army adopted the principle for the Blacker bombard and later for the Piat anti-tank weapon. In 1940, Commander Charles Goodeve of the Royal Navy's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development recognized that Blacker's spigot mortar could be adapted for anti-submarine warfare. Goodeve's team faced immediate technical challenges. The projectile needed to carry enough explosive to damage a U-boat's pressure hull on contact, but it also needed to be light enough that a simple propellant charge could launch it 250 meters. Heavy enough to sink rapidly through the water, light enough to be handled by a crew during rough seas. The engineers settled on a 7-inch diameter projectile weighing 65 pounds. The warhead contained 35 pounds of Torpex, a British explosive 50% more powerful than TNT. Torpex was a mixture of 42% RDX, 40% TNT, and 18% powdered aluminum. When detonated, it produced a shockwave that could punch through 3/4-inch steel plate. The projectile's shape was critical. Early designs used pointed noses, but testing revealed they would skip across the water surface like stones. Engineers tried flat noses. These penetrated the surface cleanly and sank in a predictable trajectory. The final design resembled a stubby cylinder with a flat nose and a hollow tubular tail. The tail fit over the spigot. Inside the tail was a small propellant charge. When triggered electrically, the charge detonated, driving the projectile off the spigot at high velocity. The contact fuse was the most technically demanding component. The projectile had to withstand the violent deceleration when it hit the water surface at high speed, but then it had to detonate reliably when it struck the relatively softer impact of a submarine hull underwater. The engineers designed a fuse with a heavy firing pin held in place by a safety mechanism. When the projectile hit water, the sudden deceleration armed the fuse. As the projectile sank, the firing pin remained cocked. If the projectile struck anything solid, the firing pin would slam forward, detonating the Torpex warhead. Testing revealed the projectile sank at 23 feet per second. A U-boat at 200 feet depth would be reached in under 9 seconds. Compare that to depth charges. The Mark 6 and Mark 7 depth charges used through 1943 sank at 8 to 9 feet per second. The late war Mark 9 had a sink rate of 14.5 feet per second. The Hedgehog projectile reached target depth in half the time of conventional depth charges. That gave U-boat commanders half the time to execute evasion maneuvers. The launcher itself was an array of 24 spigots arranged in 4 rows of 6. The spigots were angled so that when all 24 projectiles were fired in rapid succession, they would land in an elliptical pattern, approximately 140 feet by 120 feet at a range of 200 yards ahead of the ship. The entire launcher could be trained left or right to adjust aim. The firing sequence was electronically controlled and staggered. The forward row fired first, then the second row point 2 seconds later, then the third, then the fourth, This staggered firing had two advantages. First, all 24 projectiles landed in the target area at roughly the same time, despite being fired over the course of 1.2 seconds. Second, the recoil forces on the ship's deck were distributed over time instead of occurring simultaneously. This meant the weapon didn't require reinforced deck plating. It could be retrofitted to any escort vessel with sufficient forward deck space. When empty, the launcher resembled a field of steel spikes pointing upward and forward. Someone thought it looked like the pines on a hedgehog's back. The name stuck. The complete system weighed approximately 2 tons. The launcher, control box, power supply, and 24 loaded projectiles. A trained crew could reload in 3 minutes. Most destroyer escorts carried 7 full loads, 168 projectiles total. That was 7 attack runs before the ship needed to return to port for resupply. HMS Westcott, a W-class destroyer, received the first prototype installation in May 1941. Sea trials were conducted through this summer and autumn. The weapon functioned mechanically. Projectiles launched cleanly. The elliptical pattern was consistent, but there were no U-boat targets to test it against in combat. Production was authorized in late 1941. By the end of 1942, over 100 British escort vessels had been equipped with Hedgehog. The first kill didn't come until November 1942. It took that long because escort crews didn't trust the weapon. They'd been trained for years to use depth charges. Depth charges always exploded. You could hear them, feel them. Even if you missed, the explosions created a psychological effect. U-boat crews knew they were being hunted. They knew death was raining down around them. The Hedgehog was different. If you missed, nothing happened. 24 projectiles would sink silently to the ocean floor. No explosions. No indication you'd even attacked. No psychological warfare, just silence. Crews interpreted silence as failure. They assumed the weapon hadn't worked. They lost confidence. By early 1943, the Royal Navy had to issue a directive ordering captains to explain why they hadn't used Hedgehog when they had sonar contact with a U-boat. The explanations were always the same. Weather was too rough. Target was too deep. Depth charges seemed more reliable. The real reason was psychological. Hedgehog attacks felt like failure even when they weren't. The breakthrough became when the Director of Miscellaneous Weapons Development sent an officer to Londonderry, the main escort base in Northern Ireland. His mission was simple: train the crews properly, explain how the weapon actually worked, show them documented cases of successful attacks, describe what happened inside a U-boat when a Hedgehog scored a direct hit. The training emphasized 3 principles. First, Hedgehog required precise targeting information. You needed to know exactly where the submarine was when you fired. Unlike depth charges, you couldn't saturate an area and hope for cumulative damage. You needed accuracy. Second, silence after an attack meant you hadn't hit the target, but that was valuable information. Sonar contact wasn't lost. You could immediately maneuver for a second attack without waiting for underwater turbulence to clear. You could maintain pressure on the submarine, keep it submerged, keep it evading, prevent it from surfacing or escaping. Third, if you heard explosions, after firing Hedgehog, the submarine was almost certainly dead. Direct contact with a Torpex warhead punching through the pressure hull was catastrophic. No submarine could survive that kind of damage at depth. The statistics proved the point. During World War II, British escort vessels made 5,174 depth charge attacks. Those attacks resulted in 85 confirmed kills, a ratio of 60.5 to 1. The Hedgehog made 268 attacks and achieved 47 confirmed kills, a ratio of 5.7 to 1. By the end of the war, 1 in every 5 Hedgehog attacks resulted in a kill. 1 in 80 depth charge attacks resulted in a kill. The Hedgehog was more than 10 times as effective. But the real measure of effectiveness wasn't statistics. It was what happened inside a U-boat when the Hedgehog struck. A Type 7C U-boat had a pressure hull constructed of 3/4-inch steel plate stiffened by internal ribs every 2 feet. The hull was designed to withstand external pressure of 10 atmospheres. That was roughly the pressure at 330 feet depth. Deeper than that, The pressure exceeded design limits. The hull would begin to deform. Rivets would pop, welds would crack, eventually the hull would implode catastrophically. A 35-pound Torpex warhead detonating in direct contact with the hull punched a hole approximately 7 inches in diameter through both the outer hull and the pressure hull. At 200 feet depth, water pressure was 6 atmospheres, 88 pounds per square inch. Water entering through a 7-inch hole flowed at approximately 400 gallons per minute. That volume of incoming water had immediate effects. First, the submarine lost buoyancy. The flooding compartment became heavy. The boat's trim changed. It began to sink bow first or stern first, depending on which compartment was hit. Second, atmospheric pressure inside the submarine began to rise. Compressed air was normally used to blow ballast tanks and surface the boat. But when water flooded in, it compressed the air trapped inside the hull. Pressure rose rapidly from 1 atmosphere at normal conditions to 2 atmospheres, 3, 4. As pressure increased, temperature increased. The compressed air grew hot. Men's ears popped. Breathing became difficult. The air felt thick, heavy. Third, the crew lost control. Damage control parties would attempt to seal the flooding compartment, but watertight doors took time to close and dog shut. By the time the door was secured, the boat had lost depth control. It was sinking. Emergency surfacing procedures required blowing ballast tanks with high-pressure air, but if the boat had already sunk below crush depth, blowing tanks wouldn't help. The hull would implode before the submarine could reach the surface. The men in the flooding compartment had perhaps 60 seconds before conditions became unsurvivable. Water roaring through a 7-inch hole filled a small compartment in under 2 minutes. As the compartment filled, pressure spiked, temperature spiked. The air became so hot it seared lungs. Men drowned or suffocated or were scalded to death by superheated steam generated when seawater hit hot machinery. In the rest of the submarine, the crew felt the impact, heard the tearing metal, felt the boat lurch and begin to sink. They knew what was happening. They knew they were going down. Some commanders would order emergency surface, others would order full ahead, trying to maintain forward momentum and hydrodynamic lift. Neither worked once flooding exceeded a certain volume. The mathematics of buoyancy were absolute. The boat would sink to crush depth. Then the pressure hull would fail. All lights would go out. Men would be thrown against bulkheads as the hull crumpled. Some compartments would flood instantly. Others would be crushed by external pressure, killing everyone inside through sheer mechanical compression. The fortunate crews died in the first explosion. If a Hedgehog struck the control room or the forward torpedo room, the detonation would kill everyone in that compartment instantly. The blast wave propagated through the submarine at supersonic velocity. Men in adjacent compartments would die from overpressure before they even heard the sound. The unfortunate crews survived the initial hit only to drown or die by implosion as the boat sank. Those deaths took minutes. Minutes of knowing exactly what was coming. Minutes of helplessness as water pressure climbed and the hull groaned and men screamed and there was nothing anyone could do. No submarine is known to have survived a direct Hedgehog hit and returned to port. The weapon was designed to be lethal on contact, and it achieved that design objective. For U-boat commanders in the Atlantic, during 1943, the Hedgehog represented a new category of threat. They understood depth charges. Depth charges were dangerous, but survivable. Hundreds of U-boats had endured depth charge attacks and escaped. The Hedgehog was different. There was no warning, no time to evade, no opportunity to exploit the blind period. The escort maintained sonar contact until the moment of attack. The projectiles sank so rapidly that evasion maneuvers were useless. And if you were hit, you were dead. The German naval staff at U-boat headquarters in Paris received the first reports of unusual Allied attacks in early 1943. Commanders returning from patrol described destroyer escorts that maintained the sonar contact during the final approach. Attacks that came without the familiar pattern of depth charges rolling off the stern, strange thumping sounds above them. Then either silence or catastrophic explosions. Korvettenkapitän Günther Kuhnke, commanding U-125, filed a detailed report after his patrol. In March 1943, his boat had been detected by a British corvette in the North Atlantic. The corvette approached at high speed. Kuhnke ordered emergency deep and executed the standard evasion protocol. Hard turn to starboard, change depth from 200 feet to 280 feet. The maneuver should have taken U-125 out of the predicted attack zone. Instead, Kuhnke heard rapid impacts above his position, multiple projectiles striking the water in quick succession. Then, 2 explosions close aboard. The boat shuddered, electrical systems flickered, depth gauge needles jumped, but the hull held. U-125 had been missed by meters. Kuhnke escaped and returned to base. His report noted that whatever weapon the British had used, it didn't follow the normal depth charge pattern. It attacked from ahead of the escort vessel. It detonated on contact rather than at preset depth. And it came without warning during the approach phase when U-boats expected to be invisible to sonar. Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered an intelligence investigation. Staff officers reviewed patrol reports from January through April 1943. They identified 17 separate incidents where U-boats reported similar attacks, forward-throwing weapons, contact detonations, no blind period. The pattern was consistent across different operational areas. Western approaches, Mid-Atlantic, Bay of Biscay. Whatever the British had deployed, it was now standard equipment on escort vessels throughout the Atlantic. German naval intelligence designated the unknown weapon as Wurfgranat, thrown grenade. They estimated it was some type of mortar system capable of firing explosive projectiles ahead of attacking ships. They estimated range at 200 to 300 meters. They estimated warhead size at 30 to 40 kilograms, based on damage reports from boats that survived near misses. The estimates were remarkably accurate. What German intelligence couldn't determine was the deployment scale or the effectiveness rate. They knew the weapon existed. They knew it was dangerous. They didn't know how many ships carried it or how many U-boats it had already killed. The Kriegsmarine issued tactical guidance to all U-boat commanders in May 1943. When under attack by escorts using forward-throwing weapons, execute immediate depth changes. Alternate between shallow and deep, force the escort to continuously recalculate firing solutions, maintain speed variations, accelerate and decelerate unpredictably, make yourself a difficult target. The guidance was sound in theory. In practice, it rarely worked. The problem was energy. A submerged U-boat running on electric motors had limited battery capacity. High-speed evasion maneuvers drained batteries rapidly. At maximum submerged speed of 7.6 knots, a Type 7C could run for 90 minutes before batteries exhausted. At economical speed of 4 knots, endurance extended to 80 hours. But economical speed meant limited maneuverability. You couldn't execute aggressive evasion turns at 4 knots. You needed speed to change position quickly. But speed drained batteries. And when batteries exhausted, you had to surface to recharge using diesel engines. Surfacing meant vulnerability to radar detection and air attack. The tactical dilemma was inescapable. Stay deep and evade aggressively, and you'd run out of power within hours. Stay deep at economical speed, and you couldn't evade effectively. Surface to recharge, and you exposed yourself to aircraft and surface radar. U-boat commanders were caught between impossible choices, and the Hedgehog exploited every one of them. The weapon's psychological impact was as devastating as its physical effects. Depth charge attacks were terrifying, but familiar. Crews knew what to expect. The distant thunder, the shockwaves, the accumulated stress over hours of pursuit. Men could prepare themselves mentally, count the explosions, track the pattern, calculate whether the escort was getting closer or falling behind. There was agency in that knowledge. A sense that skillful evasion could produce survival. Hedgehog attacks eliminated that psychological buffer. There was no warning, no thunder in the distance, building to a crescendo, just sudden impact and instant death or the silence of a miss. Survivors who experienced both types of attacks reported that Hedgehog was worse psychologically because it gave you nothing to process. No gradual buildup of tension, no opportunity to prepare, just immediate binary outcome. You were either dead in the first 10 seconds or you'd been missed entirely. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. USS England's performance in May 1944 demonstrated the Hedgehog's full potential when operated by a well-trained crew with excellent sonar operators. England was a Buckley-class destroyer escort assigned to anti-submarine patrol in the Pacific. Between May 19th and May 31st, England sank 6 Japanese submarines using only Hedgehog attacks. I-16 on May 19th, RO-106 on May 22nd, RO-104 on May 23rd, RO-116 on May 24th, RO-108 on May 26th, RO-105 on May 31st, 6 submarines in 12 days. It was the most successful anti-submarine patrol by any single vessel in World War II. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sent England's captain a personal message stating there would always be an England in the United States Navy. The key to England's success was crew coordination. The sonar operator maintained continuous contact until the moment of attack. The Combat Information Center processed sonar data and calculated firing solutions, accounting for target depth, speed, and course. The helmsman executed precise maneuvers to position England in optimal attack geometry. The Hedgehog crew loaded and fired on command with 3-minute turnaround between salvos. Every attack was executed with mechanical precision, multiple salvos if the first missed. Maintained sonar contact throughout. No panic, no hesitation, just professional prosecution of targets until explosions confirmed kills. By late 1944, Hedgehog had become standard equipment on all Allied destroyer escorts and many corvettes in both Atlantic and Pacific theaters. American shipyards produced their own version designated Mark 10 and Mark 11, with minor modifications to the launcher geometry. Soviet naval forces received Hedgehog systems through Lend-Lease. Canadian corvettes mounted split Hedgehog installations with 12 projectiles on each side of the foredeck to preserve forward gun positions. The weapon had achieved global deployment, and Axis submarine forces had no effective counter. The final statistics tell the complete story. 268 Hedgehog attacks produced 47 confirmed submarine kills, 20% success rate. Compare that to depth charges at less than 2% success rate. Factor in that Hedgehog attacks didn't create sonar blackouts, allowing immediate follow-up attacks. Factor in faster sink rates, giving submarines less time to evade. Factor in contact detonation, ensuring maximum damage on hits. The Hedgehog was the most effective anti-submarine weapon deployed by any navy during World War II. For the U-boat crews who faced it, the Hedgehog represented the moment when the Battle of the Atlantic became mathematically unwinnable. Combined with centimetric radar, improved sonar, escort carriers providing continuous air cover, and vastly increased numbers of escort vessels, the Hedgehog closed the final tactical gap that had allowed U-boats to survive and escape. There was nowhere to hide, no blind period to exploit, no time to evade, just sudden death, delivered with mechanical precision by crews who had trained for months to kill submarines efficiently. The weapon that looked like a hedgehog's spines destroyed more submarines per attack than any other system in the war. 24 projectiles launched in 90 seconds, 7 seconds to sink to target depth, 35 pounds of Torpex detonating on contact, catastrophic pressure hull failure, total crew loss in under 2 minutes. That was the mathematical reality of Hedgehog warfare. The U-boat crews who survived encounters with it never forgot the sound. The rapid thumps of projectiles hitting water, the silence that followed, the terrible knowledge that the next salvo might be the last thing they ever heard. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.